Ernest Mandel, Leninist Theory of Organization. Chapter 8, Sociology of Economism, Bureaucratism, and Spontaneity. When we emphasized that Lenin's concept of organization in reality represents a concept of the current potential for proletarian revolution, we already touched upon the central factor in the Leninist theory of proletarian class consciousness: the problem of the definition of the revolutionary subject under capitalism. For Marx and Lenin, as well as for Luxemburg and Trotsky, although they did not draw all the necessary conclusions from this fact until some time before 1914, the revolutionary subject is the potentially only periodically revolutionary working class, as it works, thinks, and lives under capitalism, that is, in the totality of its social existence. The Leninist theory of organization proceeds directly from this assessment of the position of the revolutionary subject, for it is self-evident that a subject, thus defined, can only be a contradictory one. On the one hand, it is exposed to wage slavery, alienated labor, the reification of all human relations, and the influence of bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology. On the other hand, at periodic intervals, it passes over into a radicalizing class struggle, and even into open revolutionary battle against the capitalist mode of production and the bourgeois state apparatus. It is in this periodic fluctuation that the history of the real class struggle of the last 150 years is expressed. It is absolutely impossible to sum up the history of, say, the French or the German labor movements of the past 100 years with either the formula increasing passivity or uninterrupted revolutionary activity. It is obviously a unity of both elements, with an alternating emphasis on one or the other. As ideological tendencies, opportunism and sectarianism have their deepest theoretical roots in an undialectical definition of the revolutionary subject. For the opportunists, this revolutionary subject is the everyday worker. They tend to imitate the attitude of this worker in everything and to idolize his backward side, as Plekhanov so well put it. If the workers are concerned only with questions limited to the shops, then they are pure trade unionists. If the workers are caught up in a wave of patriotic jingoism, then they became social patriots or social imperialists. If the workers submit to Cold War propaganda, they become Cold Warriors. The masses are always right. The latest and most wretched expression of such opportunism consists of determining the program, let it be an electoral program, no longer through an objective scientific analysis of society, but with the aid of opinion polls. But this opportunism leads to an insoluble contradiction. Fortunately, the moods of the masses do not stand still, but can change dramatically in a rather short period of time. Today, the workers are concerned only with internal shop questions, but tomorrow they will throng the streets in a political demonstration. Today, they are for the defense of the imperialist fatherland against the external enemy, but tomorrow they will be fed up with the war and again recognize their own ruling class as the main enemy. Today, they passively accept collaboration with the bosses, but tomorrow they will move against it through a wildcat strike. The logic of opportunism leads, once the adaptation to bourgeois society has been excused through references to the attitude of the masses, to resistance to these very masses as soon as they begin in a sudden reversal to move into action against bourgeois society. Sectarians simplify the revolutionary subject just as much as opportunists, but in the opposite sense. If only the everyday worker counts for the opportunists, that is, the worker who is assimilating and adapting to bourgeois relations, for the sectarians, it is only the ideal proletarian, one who acts like a revolutionary, who counts. If the worker does not behave in a revolutionary fashion, he has ceased to be a revolutionary subject. He is demoted to being bourgeois. Extreme sectarians, such as certain ultra-left spontaneists, certain Stalinists, and certain Maoists, will even go as far as to equate the working class with the capitalist class if it hesitates to completely accept the particular sectarian ideology in question. Extreme objectivism on the one hand, everything the workers do is revolutionary, and extreme subjectivity on the other hand, only those who accept our doctrine are revolutionary or proletarian, join hands in the final analysis when they deny the objectively revolutionary character of huge mass struggles led by masses with a contradictory consciousness. For the opportunist objectivists, these struggles are not revolutionary because next month the majority will still go ahead and vote for the SPD, West German Social Democrats, or de Gaulle. For the sectarian subjectivists, they have nothing to do with revolution because that is our revolutionary group, is still too weak. The social nature of these two tendencies can be ascertained without difficulty. It corresponds to the petty bourgeois intelligentsia. The opportunists, for the most part, represent the intelligentsia tied to the labor bureaucracy in mass organizations or in the bourgeois state apparatus, while the sectarians represent an intelligentsia that is either declassed or merely watches things from the sidelines, remaining outside of the real movement. In both cases, the forced separation between the objective and subjective factors at work in the contradictory but undivided revolutionary subject corresponds to a divorce between practice and theory, which can lead only to an opportunistic practice and to an idealizing theory embodying false consciousness. It is characteristic, however, for many opportunists, among others trade union bureaucrats, as well as many sectarian literati, to accuse precisely the revolutionary Marxists of being petty bourgeois intellectuals who would like to subjugate the working class. This question also plays a certain role in the discussions within the revolutionary student movement. Therefore, it is necessary to analyze more closely the problem of the sociology of the bureaucracy, of economism, and of spontaneity, or of the handicraftsman's approach to the question of organization. The mediation between manual and mental labor, production and accumulation, occurs at several points in bourgeois society, though at different levels, for example, in the factory. What is meant by the general concept of intelligentsia, or intellectual petty bourgeoisie, or technical intelligentsia, corresponds in reality to many diverse actions of such mediation whose relation to the actual class struggle is quite distinct. One could essentially distinguish the following categories, which in no way do we claim constitute a complete analysis. 1. The genuine intermediaries between capital and labor in the process of production, that is, the secondary officers of capital, foremen, timekeepers, and other cadre personnel in the factories, among whose tasks is the maintenance, in the interest of capital, of labor discipline within the factory. 2. The intermediaries between science and technique, or between technique and production. Laboratory assistants, scientific researchers, inventors, technologists, planners, project engineers, draftsmen, etc. In contrast to Category 1, these layers are not accomplices in the process of extracting surplus value from the producer. They take part in the material process of production itself, and for that reason are not exploiters but producers of surplus value. 3. The intermediaries between production and realization of surplus value. Advertising managers in offices, market research institutes, cadres and scientists occupied in the distribution sector, marketing specialists, etc. 4. The intermediaries between buyers and sellers of the commodity labor power. Above all, these are the trade union functionaries, and in a wider sense, all functionaries of the bureaucratized mass organizations of the labor movement. 5. The intermediaries between capital and labor in the sphere of the superstructure, the ideological producers, that is, those who are occupied with producing ideology, a section of the bourgeois politicians, public opinion makers, the bourgeois professors of the so-called humanities, journalists, some artists, Instagram influencers, etc. 6. The intermediaries between science and the working class, the theoretical producers, who have not been professionally incorporated into the ideological production of the ruling class and are relatively able, being free from material dependency on this production, to engage in criticism of bourgeois relations. Reader's note: for the remainder of this passage, Mandel frequently refers to these categories by number. In order to make his meaning clear to listeners who do not have the luxury of easily referencing the passage on each category, at each reference I will include a representative group within the category. These are not intended to represent the whole of that category, and taken literally would be reductive, even obfuscating, as in the case of categories 5 and 6. I intend no theoretical claims of my own here, only an aid for listeners. The representatives of each category are as follows. Category 1 are the managers. Category 2, researchers. Category 3, marketers. 4, union functionaries. 5, ideologists. 6, theorists. One could add a 7th group, which is partially included in the 5th, ideologists, and partially in the 6th, theorists. In classical, stable bourgeois society, teaching as a profession falls into category 5, ideologists, both because of the unlimited predominance of bourgeois ideology and because of the generally abstract and ideological character of all professional teaching. With the growing structural crisis in the neo-capitalist high schools and universities, however, a change in its objective standards takes place. On the one hand, the general crisis of capitalism precipitates a general crisis in neo-capitalist ideology, which is increasingly called into question. On the other hand, teaching serves less as abstract ideological indoctrination and more as the direct technocratic preparation for the future intellectual workers of categories 2, researchers, and 3, marketers, to be incorporated into the process of production. This makes it possible for the content of such teaching to be increasingly tied to a regained awareness of individual alienation, as well as to social criticism in related fields, and even to social criticism in general. It now becomes clear which part of the intelligentsia will exert a negative influence upon the developing class consciousness of the proletariat. It is, above all, groups 3, marketers, 4, union functionaries, and 5, ideologists. We need say nothing about group 1, managers, because in general it keeps its distance from the workers' organizations anyway. What is most dangerous for the initiative and self-assurance of the working class is a symbiosis or fusion of groups 4, union functionaries, and 5, ideologists, as has occurred on a broad scale since the First World War in the social democratic, and today, already partially in the Moscow-oriented communist mass organizations in the West. Groups 2, researchers, and 6, theorists, on the other hand, can only enhance the impact of the working class and revolutionary organizations because they equip them with the knowledge that is indispensable for a relentless critique of bourgeois society and for the successful overthrow of this society, and even more for the successful taking over of the means of production by the associated producers. Those who rail against the growing union of workers' organizations with groups 2, researchers, and 6, theorists, of the intelligentsia objectively assist groups 3, marketers, 4, union functionaries, and 5, ideologists, in exerting their negative influence on the working class. For never in history has there been a class struggle that has not been accompanied by an ideological struggle. It boils down to a question of determining which ideology can sink roots in the working class, or, to phrase it better, whether bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideology or Marxist scientific theory will develop among the workers. Whoever opposes every outside intellectual influence within the working class in struggle either forgets or pushes aside the fact that the influence which groups 1, managers, 3, marketers, 4, union functionaries, and 5, ideologists, exert on this working class is permanently and unremittingly at work upon the proletariat through the entire mechanism of bourgeois society and capitalist economy, and that the ultra-left spontaneists have no panacea at their disposal for putting an end to this process. To thunder against the influence of Marxist intellectuals within the working class means simply to allow the influence of the bourgeois intelligentsia to spread without opposition. Still worse, by resisting the formation of a revolutionary organization and the education of professional proletarian revolutionaries, Mensheviks and spontaneists are objectively forced to help perpetuate the division between manual and intellectual labor. That is, the spiritual subjugation of the workers to the intellectuals and the rather rapid bureaucratization of the workers' organizations. For a worker who continuously remains within the capitalist process of production will most often not be in a position to globally assimilate theory, and will thereby remain dependent upon petty bourgeois specialists. For that reason, a decisive step can be taken within the revolutionary organization toward the intellectual emancipation of at least the most advanced workers, and toward an initial victory over the division of labor within the workers' movement itself, through the intermittent removal of workers from the factories. This is not yet the final word on the sociology of spontaneism. We must ask ourselves, in which layers of the working class will the antipathy and distrust towards intellectuals have the most influence? Obviously, in those layers whose social and economic existence most sharply exposes them to an actual conflict with intellectual labor. By and large, these are the workers of the small and medium-sized factories threatened by technological progress. Self-taught workers who, through personal effort, have differentiated themselves from the mass. Workers who have scrambled to the top of bureaucratic organizations. Workers who, because of their low educational and cultural level, are the furthest removed from intellectual labor, and therefore also regard it with the greatest mistrust and hostility. In other words, the social base of economist spontaneity, the handicraftsman's approach to the question of organization, and hostility towards science within the working class, is the craft layer of this class. On the other hand, among the workers of the large factories and cities, of the extensive branches of industry in the forefront of technological progress, the thirst for knowledge, the greater familiarity with technical and scientific processes, and the greater audacity in projecting the conquest of power in both the factory and the state make it much easier to understand the objectively necessary role of revolutionary theoreticians and of the revolutionary organization. The spontaneous tendencies in the labor movement often, if not always, correspond exactly to this social basis. This was especially true for anarcho-syndicalism in the Latin countries before the First World War. This was also true for Menshevism, which was thoroughly defeated by Bolshevism in the large metropolitan factories, but which found its most important proletarian base in the typically small-town mining and oil field districts of southern Russia. Attempts today, in the era of the Third Industrial Revolution, to revive this craftsman caste approach under the pretext of guaranteeing workers' autonomy could only have the same result as in the past, namely, to dissipate the forces of the advanced and potentially revolutionary working class, and to give a boost to the semi-craft, bureaucratized sections of the movement that are under the constant influence of bourgeois ideology.